Hello, dear friends. Yes. Brian, we can start. I'll
Okay, I hope that this is working now. Welcome everyone, and apologies for the change of the last minute. We have a problem with the Zoom platform. So very fast, we need to migrate to a new platform, WebEx. So thank you very much for all those people who made it to change. And let's start with this event. I hope welcome everyone who's following us now on WebEx and on the Facebook page of the Permanent Mission of Israel. My name is Brian Frenkel. I'm the Human Rights and Humanitarian Affairs Advisor of the Permanent Mission of Israel here in Geneva. And for those who doesn't know what permanent missions do, basically they are the representation of the state, in this case, the State of Israel, for all the international organizations who are present in Geneva. From the UN to include the Human Rights Council and the treaty bodies to specialized agencies such as the ILO, WTO, among others. On behalf of the Mission of Israel, I would like to thank you all for joining us today on this new web talk. We have so far 5 web talks before this one, and as you know, the objective of these web talks are to put forward what we consider are very important issues to be discussed and to tackle them following the point of view of Israeli experts. So sorry, I don't know what is this noise. If everyone can to silence themselves, that will be great. So we can go ahead. But we're very pleased of having Professor Ruth Halperin-Kaddari to address the gender implications of COVID-19. And we believe that in this context, in the context of the COVID-19, this is a very important topic to discuss, and it should be including us, everyone, in these kind of discussions. The gender implications of this pandemic is not limited only to women issues. And actually, we noticed when we saw the registration for the Zoom, now in WebEx, it's different, but we were surprised to notice actually that 90% of the people who registered were women. So we hope that in the future, more men will also get involved and be part of these conversations, because we believe that it's very important for all of us to understand and discuss this. Before starting with the actual discussion, let me give the floor to Ambassador Aviva Shechter, who is the permanent representative of Israel here in Geneva. Aviva, you have the floor.
Very good. Okay, so thank you, Brian, and welcome everybody. I am truly sorry for the last minute technical problems, but I am very happy to see that many of you are here, and hopefully if some of you could not be with us because of this technical problem, we will do another one. Anyhow, it's indeed a pleasure to have Professor Ruth Halperin-Kaddari with us. It's a privilege. Brian will tell us more about her professional experience and background later on, but this is indeed a timely discussion, and I'm looking forward to having it. Let me say that women's rights are human rights. The statement that seemed revolutionary only a few decades ago is an accepted truth by now, almost trivial. But when it comes to reality, it seems that the promise and this truth is not always kept. Therefore, in our web talk series on human rights in Corona times, it is only fitting to address women's rights and talk about the gendering implications of the pandemic. The soaring rates of violence against women cannot be denied or overlooked. Regrettably, there are many more aspects in which women's and girls' vulnerability has increased and will most probably even be worsened. It is therefore urgent to initiate a range of measures and policies on the local and global levels to be adopted. The acknowledgement and awareness of these urgent needs are in line with the global vision of the SDGs and the 2030 Agenda, in particular, goal number 5 on gender equality. So I'll stop here and I'll just say that I'm truly looking forward to having this important discussion. I'm sure it will be also constructive. And without further ado, Brian, the floor is yours. Thank you all.
Thank you, Aviva. Before we start the discussion, let me explain how this will work. So we will have 20 minutes now where I'll present some questions to Professor Halperin-Kaddari. And then after that, we will open the floor for Q&A. So we are very interested in hearing from the audience questions and comments. So now, if anyone who's following us on WebEx would like to make a question, please feel free to include them on the chat box that you will have on your right on the screen. And for those who are following us on Facebook, please write them as a comment to the post that is actually live streaming this event. During these 20 minutes, we will try to put them together, and then depending on the time, we will select some of these issues for Professor Halperin-Kaddari, so we can address them before we conclude. Now let's move to the discussion, and I have the pleasure to introduce you to Professor Ruth Halperin-Kaddari. She's a professor of law, graduated of the Yale Law School, and founding director of the Radford Center at the Bar Ilan University in Israel. She's a family law expert in both the civil legal system and traditional Jewish law, and has recently completed 3 terms as a member and vice president of 2 of them at the UN Committee for the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, the CEDAW, for those who know the acronym. She publishes on family law in Israel, legal pluralism, feminism, and international women's rights, and her book on women in Israel was published by the University of Pennsylvania Press. She's a recipient of numerous national and international grants and prizes, including with the H2020 and the ERA framework, 3 times from the Israeli Foundation, the U.S. Department of Women Courage Award, the Rappaport Prize for Women Generating Change in Israel Society, the Knights of Quality Government Award, and more. In 2018, she was named one of the apolitical 100 most influential people in gender policy around the world. During her term on the CEDAW in 2013, she led the successful adoption of a new general recommendation on the economic consequences of family relations and their distribution, and has conducted in 2018 the inquiry into the North Island restrictive abortion regime, which led in October last year to the decriminalization of abortion in Northern Ireland, an unprecedented move in international human rights law. So it's clear that she has a lot of knowledge to share with us. But before starting, I would like to remind you that the views that she will express does not necessarily reflect per se the views of the permanent mission of Israel or the government of Israel. So, Professor Kaddari, to start the discussion, I would like to ask you something. The COVID crisis has highlighted many important issues to consider in the context of the fight for gender equality, such as the increase in violence against women, distribution of the burden and responsibilities at home, among others. What can you tell us about this?
Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you, Brian, and thank you, Ambassador Raz Schechter, for introducing me and obviously for hosting me. Just to make sure that everybody can hear me, I'm not used to this platform this past 3 months. Like all other academics around the world, I've been roaming the Zoom almost every day, doing our teaching through Zoom. So it's a bit of an unsettling change to communicate and not through the regular platform. Okay. So I'm really glad to have this opportunity to address those who are interested in gendered implications of the coronavirus crisis. And just as you said, Brian, I think everybody's attention is really focused on the terrible, just unprecedented soaring rates of violence against women, which have been there right from the beginning. And we, those of us who are familiar in feminist activism, internationally or domestically, could just anticipate this based on previous experiences, based on previous unfortunate crises like the Ebola crisis or the Zika crisis, pandemics or epidemics, and other crises. But what is less being drawing attention are the other aspects of this crisis. And I think that it is very fair to say that what the virus is doing, what COVID-19 is doing, is really weakening those who are weak or vulnerable to begin with. And even though it's you know, people usually say that the virus does not discriminate between men or women, or between the strong and the weak, and between countries, and it hits everybody. So it's true that it hits everybody, but the effects of how it hits and the effects of those who are able to recover and those who are unable to recover and will most probably be much, much worse off than previously, the effects are completely disparate and different. And women as a group are more vulnerable and weaker than men as a group in our patriarchal world, whether it is the global north or the global south. So it's not just violence against women, and we'll talk more about that. And it's not just the economic aspects and the higher rates of women who are now losing their jobs and will most probably not have a job when the lockdown eases and when hopefully the crisis will be over. It's not just that, and it's not just the increased care work and the fact that if we previously talked about the double burden of women, both as bread earners outside the home and as caretakers inside the home, now it's the triple burden or even more than that, because the burden of taking care of children who are now locked at home with their parents is falling mostly on women. And it's not just the higher risk of women who are more vulnerable to contract the virus because they make most of the caregiving workforce. More than 70% of caregivers, of healthcare providers around the world are actually women, and more than 80% worldwide are actually women. So they are much more susceptible to contract the virus, and we already have the data about that. And it's also those aspects that people do not usually think about, the lack of accessibility of women to those health issues and medical needs that only women need, such as the sexual and reproductive health needs, abortion, for example, the complete shutdown of abortion services in so many parts of the world, partly because of lack of facilities and lack of contraceptives because of the shutdown of international trade, but also partly because of political opportunism from governments who just seize this opportunity to adopt more measures, harsher measures about against women and against women's empowerment and equality. So there's so many range of aspects that we do not usually think about, and part of our, I think of our aim and our mission is, first of all, to simply raise awareness and to call for more, not just more awareness, but more knowledge, more information, more data, and to make sure that all this is really registered within the awareness and the commitment of governments, of policymakers around the world, and understand that unless women are in parity with men in leading the world and in taking decisions, this is not going to change. So I think I'll be very happy to expand afterwards about women's leadership and what we can learn from this real-time exercise of comparing female leadership to male leadership. And let me just say here that I think everybody heard that New Zealand, led by Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern, is the first country in the world to be free of the coronavirus. And there's a lot more to say about her type of leadership.
Thank you, Professor. Following this idea of what you were expressing, do you have any thoughts on particular on the world of work? Because we're slowly starting to move towards this new normality, and we're trying to balance coming back to work fully or partially, but maybe there are lessons learned there for everyone that we can take on the way forward in this respect.
Right. There are many lessons to take from this. When it started, when the crisis started, people, economists, scholars of employment and economy went back to the 2008 recession, financial crisis, and tried to compare. And the 2008 was somewhat also labeled men's session, because more men at that time lost their jobs compared with women. But that was because that crisis hit mostly the financial world and the financial industry and the high-tech industry, where men are more concentrated. And the recovery was fairly quick. And data also shows that even during that crisis, men recovered faster than women. So it's not that only men lost their jobs, women also lost their jobs. Men came back in full force into the employment market much, much faster than women. This crisis now is totally different. It hits the services industry. And in so many parts of the world, this industry will hardly recover, or it will take much, much longer for that industry to recover. It's the tourism, it's all the other services, it's the restaurants, the small enterprises where women are more concentrated, plus women are much, much more concentrated in the informal sector, which is mostly in the global south, or in the gig economy, which typifies the global north. And in all these industries, when you can't get out of the house and you can't do your vendoring on the streets, just as an example, you lose your way of earning your sustainability, and it's not going to come back. So women are definitely being hit much, much harder. Adding to that, what I already mentioned before, the fact that the burden of taking care of all those who are at home is much higher on women's shoulders than on men's shoulders. So governments have to be aware of all this, to take that into consideration. And when they plan on all their emergency aid economic plans, interjecting money into the economy, they have to make sure that to channel the money to those areas where women need it more, where women are more concentrated, instead of channeling all the money to the strong and big enterprises, which also need it, but they have many, many more ways of sustaining, of overcoming this crisis than the individual women who are really facing the most terrible situation that we could envisage. And without the organized and adequate and equitable policy by governments, they will not be able to overcome this, and it will undoubtedly have its repercussions on the children and on the next generations. So eventually everybody is going to pay this price.
Thank you. Thank you. I have a follow-up question with this. I understand your idea of the role that governments have to play with this. But what do you think about us as a society? Because it has been a test not only for governments, but also for us as a society. Everyone is now locked down at home, or everyone has been teleworking, or all these kind of ideas. So maybe there are lessons for us as a society that we can get from this process and maybe work towards more equal society in the future.
I agree wholeheartedly. I think that one of the lessons that we can take from this experience, and it ties together with feminist thought and philosophy, is the convergence of the society at large with everything that takes place at home, within the family, and within the four walls of one's home. The lines between the outside and the inside have been completely blurred. And it's paradoxical, right? Because actually the lockdown means that everybody should stay at home, but everybody should stay at home in order to protect the society at large, in order to take everybody's role within the responsibility of the community at large. So in that sense, these lines have been completely blurred. And just like you say, it's really not just the responsibility of the governments, it's the responsibility of everybody, every individual. And I think that what we've seen are some really incredible examples of solidarity and of volunteering and of communities coming together, people coming together. Well, you know, from the experience of those of us who are more privileged in the global north, we've witnessed it through the technological means of the media, you know, WhatsApp and all those YouTube videos that have been passing on throughout the world. But I've read about the experiences in other communities in other parts of the world that also signify this kind of sharing and of solidarity and of taking care one another. And I think this is a very, very important lesson that can be taken from now onwards. And it also, to some extent, I think it contradicts perception of many world leaders and many philosophers about the nature of human beings. And I actually think it also serves to contradict the very prevalent perception of neoliberalism, of the individual as autonomous, as only taking care of himself, mostly himself or herself. And what we've witnessed now is a complete contradiction in terms of the human experience. And maybe this is some you know, some venue to be more optimistic about how the world can continue from now on. And I think it also ties with what I mentioned before about the differences between female leadership and male leadership, between those countries who are led by women, those countries who are led by men, not necessarily based on the simple sexual gender lines, but in terms of the political ideology and of the leadership style. So we can expand on that perhaps later.
If you would like to expand it now, we will be very happy to listen your ideas on this matter.
So I just published a short article with a colleague, Ambassador Don Steinberg from the United States, where we analyzed this incredible phenomena, which I called a real-time experience. We almost have like a laboratory where we have those very few countries that are led by women. You know that hardly 10% of the countries in the world today have women as the heads of state, which is really embarrassing. But you take this small group and you compare it with the group of countries, all the rest, who are led by men. And you, first of all, simply just compare the outcomes and the results. in terms of overcoming the coronavirus itself. And the results are just undeniable in terms of who fares better. And I just mentioned New Zealand as the first country to completely be free of coronavirus. But it's not just this very narrow set of data. It's the whole package of how the society fares. What is the degree of trust, of solidarity within the people? And you compare the style of leadership, and you see, you take Prime Minister Ardern, you take the Prime Minister of Norway, you take Chancellor Merkel, and you see how they address their people. You see how they engage in sharing responsibility, in being able to admit mistakes, how they raise the trust within their people, how they show both authority together with empathy and honesty above all. And all these are traits of leadership that are more associated with women than with men. And it's not necessarily, there's a huge discussion, that dates back within feminist scholarship about these differences. There are many feminists who would not accept this at all, but even those who accept it argue whether it is something inherent within the women as opposed to men, or is it something which is during women's socializing. Women are more used to operate within conflicting roles, which actually really describe women's constant lives and beings. And women are more used to, are better dealing with multifaceted and complex situations. So all this actually makes their leadership more equipped, more adequate to face such crisis, to face such unprecedented challenges. And that's why I'm saying that we can actually see how it works in reality during this time of the coronavirus crisis. And there's more to that in terms of global politics. If we if we want to think about what we can take ahead for future in terms of lessons learned. So again, going back to the feminist argument about the non-distinction between, about the very old argument that the public is private and the private is public, and this dichotomy which patriarchy was so keen on setting, this dichotomy should be lifted, should be eliminated. So likewise, what we've seen now during this crisis is that the welfare of the people, the well-being of the people, the health, is no less a security concern than issues of borders, of peace and war. And when governments are thinking about national security, these concerns, which usually are more identified with women's needs and with women's concerns, the welfare and the health, these concerns are no less important and must be prioritized and must be resourced in the same manner and even more than those very traditional male security concerns. And the same goes when we are thinking about global politics and about international organizations and about the role of the UN. The powers of peacekeeping forces should be available for needs of global medical cooperation, just like they are in place for keeping world peace, because this crisis showed us that these concerns are no less important than the traditional concerns of war and peace.
Thank you, Professor. We have received some questions now, so I will try to link them actually, and one of them is actually in line to my follow-up question, so I will try to put them together. So the first one that we receive, and it's how can we work together to put pressure, especially now in ministries or mechanisms and instruments, to make sure that by gender vouchering, regarding to the budget, that all crisis response will now finally be designed to serve the objectives of gender equality and women's rights. I don't know if you have any ideas on that. No, so when we prepare for a new one, let's do a gender budget.
I agree, and gender budgeting, gender mainstreaming, all these methodologies are well known and are being pushed, going back to the role of the CEDAW committee in overseeing the implementation of commitments that governments have taken upon themselves when they joined the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. So one of our main recommendations, or rather actually requests from all reporting states, was to constantly engage in gender mainstreaming and in gender budgeting. And this must be very, very high on the priority of all governments and all decision makers, both local and global. But that must mean that women should not only be at the table. It's not just that women should have a place at the table. It means that there must be parity. There must be equal representation, equal number of men and women who are committed to true gender equality, to truly take into consideration women's and children's needs and concerns. Without that, the whole society is going to lose. The overcoming of the crisis depends on the way and the measure and the scope that women as a group can overcome this crisis.
Thank you very much. You mentioned the CEDAW committee, and we know that you have a lot of experience there. One of the questions that we receive is if you're aware of any initiatives that are going on now within the committee to address the gender issues that have come up due to the COVID, or if the CEDAW is working with governments to help them enact policies and help them protect women.
Yeah, definitely. So the CEDAW committee was one of the first international bodies to come up with a statement about the coronavirus and the gender implications of the coronavirus already as early as March. And they also issued guidelines of what governments must be doing in order to face the crisis with the scope, with the gender lens in mind. A very detailed document of guidelines, and I really salute them in managing to come up with very, very clear guidelines. But they were not the only ones. They were one of the first. UN Women is constantly engaging in not just collecting data and information, but also in issuing recommendations and guidelines. The group of ministries, I'm sorry, I forget the exact title, but those governments who are part of the Istanbul Convention on the Council of Europe Convention on gender-based violence against women and domestic violence. So the group of ministers there also came up with a collection of good practices, best practices, with very important information, and that goes back to the issue of violence against women. So you can see from their collection of documents, you can see how some governments have responded very quickly in allocating more resources to tackle the soaring rates of violence against women, to provide for shelters, because this unprecedented situation of no shelters at all. And when home obviously is not the shelter, when home is the place where women face their abusers and there's nowhere to go and there's complete isolation, and women have completely lost all their external help resources and sources of support resources. So some of the governments were quite quickly to offer to convert hotels into shelters for women who must escape their homes, or the opposite, to send abusers to those hotels or other places where, in order to keep them in distance, to be able to provide for restraining orders. So again, under the Istanbul Convention, you can see all this material gathered, and you can see some very, very good guidelines and advice for government. So there's really a lot that has been going on the international front, both from international organizations and from civil society and international non-governmental organizations. The main issue is, of course, governmental commitment and governmental understanding that this is not a question of luxury. It's a question of simply of survival, of societal survival, and not just women's survival, because women's survival is societal survival.
Thank you very much. I follow up on this idea when you started mentioning some examples of policies that were adopted by governments. And one of the questions that we got refers to this idea of countries developing new policies to address the COVID situation, and if there are opportunities there to include positive change for women.
So I think that what really emerges first are all those measures that some governments have already adopted or are adopting to tackle the problem of gender-based violence against women, of the increased measures of violence, because this is really the most apparent. So as I mentioned, creating shelters, providing support services, having police become more active in finding out what happens with women who have known to be suffering from abusers or are survivors of abuse, providing the possibility of silent emergency calls through text messages, for example, or the legal measures. One of the worst problems was that the judicial system had almost come to a complete shutdown, at least at the beginning of the lockdown, and it took some time before judiciaries reopened or partially reopened or reopened through remote services, like we're conducting our webinar now, and that is another example of countries that should adopt the possibility of continuing to engage to provide legal services and judicial services through remote technology. In the center, the Rackman Center that I'm heading for the advancement of women, we focus on family law issues, on providing free legal aid for women in divorce proceedings. And at first, during the first 2 months, our helpline actually decreased in numbers of calls, but we knew very well that the peak is just about to come. And indeed, it comes now. We already have 4 times call-ins than in previous years during this time of the year, because as the lockdown eases and the family crisis, some due to the increased violence, some due to the economic circumstances, but the crises are, again, they are also soaring, and women are in need of legal aid. Governments that, due to the austerity measures, severely cut down on legal aid must now put back the resources. They must provide the possibility for women and children to go on with their lives, and they must provide the legal aid to do that. In terms of employment, as I said, the focus should be diverged not just to those big enterprises and big economical ventures, but to the very, very small scale enterprises, to the informal sector, to the informal economy, and to channel the money, the emergency aid to those areas, and not just to the big companies. And I just want to add that looking back at, we could say 100 years of feminist revolution, because it's really the 2019, 2020, celebrating the centennial of many countries in the world that actually provided the very basic first human right, civil right for women, the suffrage, the right to vote and be elected to office. So we are 100 years within this phase of the feminist revolution, and we've made progress, but the progress that we've made is not that vast. Looking at the numbers, just as I mentioned before, only 10% of countries in the world have women in their leadership, and less than 25% women composing members of parliaments around the world, and that's just one measure. So the progress is there, but it's slow, it's not huge. And what is really striking and so alarming and disturbing is that as soon as such a crisis happens, so much of the progress is being set back, and the regression is so strong. On the other hand, we do have enough commitment, we have enough women in world leadership to push for halting this setback. And this kind of discussions, of seminars, of webinars are really part of this development.
Thank you, Professor. Our time is running short. I have one last question that we received that is more related to the idea of the intersectionality of discrimination. You know, women, as you said, it's very important that sometimes they see themselves increase in the violation of their rights, either because of age or because they are indigenous people or migrants or they have a disability. So what are your thoughts about that, or how can we move forward with that?
Right. So intersectionality is really one of the strongest challenges that we're facing in policy making, in contemplating what measures should be taken, because so many women face multiple facets of discrimination based on gender, based on age, based on ethnicity, of migrant background, of religiosity, and so many other factors, sexual orientation, gender identity. And in terms of what should be done, whether it is in international documents such as CEDAW and CEDAW's general recommendation, for example, general recommendation number 28, or other international documents, Security Council decision 1325, for instance, they all express awareness of the particular problem of intersectionality, and they all direct governments and policymakers to be aware of the particular vulnerability due to this phenomena of intersectionality, so that concerns and increased vulnerability of women within these particular situations must be taken into consideration, and redress must be given due to all this complex compound discrimination. So if we talk about women around the table, and if we talk about parity, and if we talk about representation of women, we actually mean not just women as people in female bodies, we also mean women who belong to all these different groups, whether it is older women, younger women, single women, women with disabilities, lesbian women, trans women, Black women, white women, every group which is susceptible to compounded discrimination and compounded vulnerability. And likewise, when governments construct programs, they have to take into consideration these particular needs of these groups of women. And again, it all comes back to the question of awareness and commitment. Regrettably, we see many examples of governments, just as I mentioned, who seize the opportunity to cut back on human rights, on women's rights. But then on the other hand, we see how governments which are committed to feminist values and to the advancement of women and gender equality, how their people fare a lot better, how their states really overcome the crisis in a much, much better way. And there's just hope that that this kind of leadership and policies will overcome the other type.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It has been extremely interesting. I'm going to just try to make a wrap up of some of the ideas that I took note. I know that I'm not going to make justice to everything that we have discussed, everything that you have mentioned, but I think that it was key, the message that you said, this idea of weaken those who are weak or are vulnerable, and the idea of the effect are different. And this is something that we have to keep into account, regardless of whatever happens there. I think that it's very important what you highlighted of race awareness and data collection, especially when we're talking about access to health services, especially sexual and reproductive health and rights. This idea of we need to know what is happening and we need to know where the help is not getting there. And then it was very interesting for me, this idea of the two crises, the comparison of the two crises, and this idea that in this crisis, women are more affected and men recover faster. But so here we need to actually put resources where it can have a better impact on women, where activities where women are concentrated. I was fascinated by all the discussion about the leadership by women that you said, and I think that you started with that and end up with that same idea at the end of this idea of changing how governments react and include these part of their policies at every level. This idea of the hope of changing leadership that will help to improve societies. And I like this idea that you propose of women's survival as part of society survival. So I think that we have received a lot of ideas, food for thought, that we can learn from here and go back slowly to our new normality and keep this in mind on what to do. But before closing, I would like to give you back the floor to know if you have any additional thoughts or conclusion that you would like to share with us.
Well, thank you so much. I think you did an excellent job in wrapping up the main ideas that I tried to convey during this talk. And again, just as I said, I think that these opportunities of sharing the ideas, of discussing the particular aspects that very often are not being paid attention to is really part of the process of advancing women as a group and of advancing society at large and human rights at large. And I really thank you and appreciate the opportunity that you gave me to take part in this venture. So thank you very much.
We would like to thank you on behalf of the mission for your participation. It has been very enriching for us. Before we conclude, I want to remind that we'll continue with some events, and we will let everyone know afterwards the new events and the new dates. But as always, you can write to us and follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. It's at Israel in Geneva. So there we will be happy to answer any questions, and we will share any information about upcoming events that we may have. So once again, thank you, Professor, for being with us today. And thank you to all for staying with us. And apologies again for the inconvenience and changing the platform. But I think that it was the way to start a bit later. Stay safe and have a very nice day. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you.